Hi friends, welcome to the first part of our story, one steeped in quiet sorrow, hidden courage, and the ghostly hush of a world transformed. Over the next 20 evenings, we'll explore what life was like during the Spanish flu pandemic from 1918 to 1920. But tonight, we begin at the edge of that story, just before the whisper turned into a scream. In the spring of 1918, the world was already unraveling. The Great War, what many had hoped would be the war to end all wars, was still clawing through Europe's soil, churning meadows into graveyards and filling the skies with smoke instead of birdsong. In muddy trenches and crowded military camps, men coughed and bled and waited, but amidst the thunder of artillery, another sound began to rise, softer but more insidious, a cough, just a cough. At first, it began quietly. In a camp in Kansas, they say, Camp Funston, where young American soldiers trained before sailing to Europe. The soldiers were tired, hungry, and packed shoulder to shoulder. They'd seen worse than a little fever. So when Private Albert Gitchell, a company cook, came to the infirmary complaining of a sore throat and headache on March 4th, 1918, few thought much of it. By lunchtime, over 100 men had joined him. Within a week, the camp infirmary was bursting, and soon after that, the trains carried the sick eastward, toward the ports, the ships, and then the world. But before the pandemic's breath reached every corner of the earth, life in 1918 carried on, cloaked in routines that seemed eternal. Cities were alive with the click-clack of hooves and the rattle of trams. Children played in alleyways, with hoop and stick. Women wore wide-brimmed hats, their gloves tucked neatly at the wrist, stepping into bakeries that smelled of fresh rye and cinnamon. Men read newspapers by gaslight, brows furrowed over war reports, unaware that darker news would soon arrive hidden in the ink of obituaries. There was no television, no internet, no 24-hour alerts. News travelled by word of mouth or through broadsheets pinned to wooden boards on the street corner. By the time people heard about the flu, it had already passed through their door. And the virus, it wasn't. Like any they had known, it moved fast, unseen. It seemed to strike the strong more than the weak. Young adults, in the prime of their lives, would wake with a headache and be gone by sunset. Their lips turned blue, their lungs filled with fluid. Doctors called it heliotrope cyanosis. A poet might have called it death's kiss. The world had no defenses, no vaccines, no antivirals, not even a clear understanding of what viruses were. Germ theory was still new, only decades old, and many still clung to old ideas. That disease came from bad air, or God's punishment, or moral decay. Hospitals overflowed, coffins ran out. In some towns, carts rolled down the streets each morning, calling for the dead to be brought out. In Philadelphia, 4,500 people died in a single week. Still, the trains ran. The war continued. Armistice was on the horizon. And governments, desperate to maintain morale, downplayed the illness. That's why it became known as the Spanish flu. Not because it came from Spain, but because Spain, being neutral in the war, was the first to report on it honestly. But let us return now to a quieter place. Let us sit, not in the chaos of a military camp or the halls of power, but in a small home on a cobbled street, perhaps in Pennsylvania, or maybe in Liverpool. It hardly matters, for the story was much the same in every town. Imagine a mother, perhaps in her 30s, with 3 children. Her husband is away at war. She works as a seamstress, stitching coats by the window each morning, her fingers worn and red from the needle. The news has reached her, of course. Rumours of the grip, as it was called, a fever going round. But life must go on. The children must eat. And then one day, her youngest coughs. Not a normal cough. It is wet, rattling, cruel. She watches, helplessly, as her child burns with fever, and there is nowhere to take him. The hospital is full. The doctor is overrun. The neighbours whisper behind curtains. No one dares come inside. This woman, this mother, sits beside her child through the night, pressing a cool rag to his brow, humming a lullaby she once heard in childhood. She does not sleep. She listens to every breath, and when morning comes, the child does not wake. She wraps him in a blanket she once made for his christening, and she places a candle in the window as the priest instructed. It is the sign for the undertaker. He will come when he can. Outside, the town bells ring for another, and another. This was the world at the edge of a whisper, a world just before the storm broke fully across the globe. And so, dear friends, tonight we rest on the cusp of that great and sorrowful tide. In the chapters ahead, we will walk through villages and cities, through homes and hospitals, through loss and resilience. We will meet nurses and children, gravediggers and priests, soldiers and wives, each one caught in the quiet, brutal embrace of the pandemic. But for now, let the candle burn low. Let your eyes close gently, and let us sleep beneath the hush of history. The first time the fever came to the little village of Wickmere, it arrived not with horns or fanfare, but hidden in a basket of bread. It was the early summer of 1918, and Wickmere was a quiet hamlet nestled amidst the low hills of Norfolk, England. No more than 24 cottages lined its narrow, rutted road, each roof thick with moss and memory. Sheep grazed along the pastures. Children skipped stones in the stream. The war was distant, heard only in the letters from sons and brothers far away. But the flu, that too seemed like a rumour from the cities, something the newspapers exaggerated until the baker fell ill. Marjorie Tilton, widow and mother of 2, was the baker's sister. She lived 2 doors down, in a cottage shaded by an ancient oak tree. Every Tuesday and Friday, she received a small bundle of loaves from her brother, warm, soft, and dusted in flour. She sold them from her garden gate, along with fresh eggs and lavender. Her customers were few, but faithful. That Tuesday in June, the loaves were late. She noticed at once. The sun had already lifted high, casting sleepy heat over her tomatoes, when her nephew arrived instead. He was a boy of 11, solemn-eyed and quiet. "Uncle George is poorly," he said simply, setting down the bread basket. "He says he's got the grip." Marjorie's heart sank, not because of the bread, but because she had heard that word before. Grip. The old name. The name people used when they didn't want to say influenza. She thanked the boy, then watched as he walked away, his shoulders thin beneath his patched shirt. She should have sent him home, but the bread was still warm and her customers would be waiting. So she unwrapped the cloth and began her morning routine. She didn't know then that the cloth carried more than bread. By the week's end, 3 cottages had fallen silent, a child in one, an old man in another, and the postmaster's wife in a third. The doctor, who came from the next village over, arrived only after 2 days of pleading. His horse trotted slowly down the lane, its hooves muffled by dust, and when he dismounted, he already looked weary. "It's the same as in Norwich," he said, wiping his brow. "Same in Cambridge, everywhere now. Best stay indoors." But people couldn't stay indoors. The cows needed milking, the gardens needed weeding, and in the absence of telegrams or radio, news still travelled by hand, letters delivered mouth to mouth. Still, a strange quiet began to settle over Wickmere. Church bells stopped ringing. The schoolhouse locked its doors. On Sundays, Reverend Hargrove preached from the rectory steps, his voice carried by the wind to the sparse few gathered at a distance. He spoke of trials, of endurance, of the book of Job. But the villagers looked not to heaven, but to their children. Some wore scarves over their mouths. Others sprinkled vinegar across their doorsteps. Old wives' tales resurfaced like driftwood. Burn onions, hang garlic, drink boiled birch bark, anything to keep the sickness out. But it still came. Marjorie began to cough by the second week. It was not the kind of cough one gets from flour dust or cold morning air. It rumbled deep in the chest, followed by shivers and a pounding in the temples. She tried to hide it from her boys, William and Francis, but children know the sounds of sorrow too well. She kept them outside when she could. She told them to stay away from the cottage. "Pick gooseberries," she said. "Gather firewood. Don't worry for me." But she knew they did, and in the lonely hours of evening, when the sun slid behind the wheat fields and the sky blushed gold, she would press a damp cloth to her forehead and whisper the names of the ones she'd already buried. Her husband, lost to the Somme. Her sister, taken by fever years ago. Her mother, gone in childbirth. She wondered if she would soon join them. In the fields beyond the village, a new ritual had begun. The gravedigger, an old man named Percival Dunning, came each evening with his spade. He dug not one grave, but 2 or 3, sometimes 4. He dug slowly, methodically, his back bent and face calm. He did not rush, for there was no more rushing now. He had seen many deaths in his time. This was simply another harvest. When he was done, he laid bundles of lavender atop the fresh earth. It was said to keep the air sweet. It was also said to keep away the flu. No one knew if it helped, but it was something to do, and doing something was better than doing nothing. By the 3rd week, Marjorie's fever broke. She awoke one morning to the sound of birdsong, real birdsong, not imagined in fevered dreams. Her lips were dry, her skin thin as paper, but her mind was clear. The sunlight spilled through the window like a blessing. Outside, her boys were playing marbles. She watched them in silence, her heart swelling with fragile relief. Not all survived, but some did. Wickmere would not be the same. No village was, but it remained, and those who endured would carry its stories forward. The breadbasket that had once carried the sickness was now burned. The bakery never reopened. But each year in June, Marjorie planted violets in the shape of a cross behind her cottage, one bloom for each neighbour lost. And so, as the summer of 1918 waned, the Spanish flu moved on, seeking new towns, new homes, new lungs to claim. But in Wickmere, where the silence once pressed like fog, life began to return, slowly, softly, like breath after a long sleep. We shall follow the flu's next step in our next chapter, where it touches a bustling port city and meets the doctors, who tried in vain to understand it. But for now, let your thoughts drift gently to Wickmere's fields, quiet, sunlit, and golden. The storm has passed here for now. Let us rest. It was said that ships carried many things, spices, coal, men, and mail. But in the autumn of 1918, the ships brought something colder, quieter, and far more cruel. In the port city of Halifax, Nova Scotia, where gulls cried over grey waters, and salt clung to every window pane, life moved with the rhythm of the tides. It was a city stitched together by sailors and widows, merchants and longshoremen. Children ran barefoot on damp wooden planks, and steamships came and went like clockwork, their smokestacks breathing mist into the overcast sky. But one October morning, a vessel arrived not with cargo, but with coughs. The HMS Armbrook, a naval transport ship, docked on October 2nd, 1918. Her decks were lined not with men on leave, but with hollow-eyed soldiers wrapped in wool blankets. Some were too weak to stand. Others had died before the ship even reached the pier. The harbour physician, Dr. Edwin Langley, boarded her with a clipboard in hand and a knot in his chest. He had read the reports: flu in Boston, flu in New York. He had hoped the Atlantic's chill would delay its arrival, but hope was thin armour. He didn't make it past the second deck before he vomited over the rail. The smell of sweat, vomit, and stale breath clung to the air. 37 soldiers lay below, many moaning, some delirious. A few, with blue-black lips and bleeding noses, stared up at him with eyes glassy and pleading. He turned away. "Quarantine," he whispered. Now, the ship was anchored offshore. No one disembarked. Not officially, but rumours travelled faster than fever. A deckhand rowed ashore that evening for bread. A nurse, curious about her fiancé aboard, sneaked a glance through a spyglass. A boy, hired to ferry notes between ships, carried more than love letters. By the time the authorities closed the dockyards, it was too late. The flu was already ashore. In the tightly packed quarters of Halifax's North End, where immigrants lived cheek by jowl in narrow tenements, the sickness found fertile ground. Irish, Scots, Lebanese and Micmac families had little space to spare and less time for illness. Fathers worked the docks, mothers took in washing, and children roamed free, their laughter echoing through alleys. But soon, laughter turned to coughing. At first, the signs were mild: a headache, a sore throat. Then came the fever. And then, too often, the blood. Children came home from school pale and trembling. Grandfathers fell asleep in rocking chairs and did not wake. Entire households sickened overnight. The city morgue, small and orderly, quickly filled. Bodies were stored in church basements under blankets soaked in vinegar. The gravediggers could not keep pace. Dr. Langley, though exhausted and unshaven, did not stop. He travelled street to street in his buggy, lantern swaying, a scarf tied around his face. With him rode Sister Agnes, a nun from St. Dominic's. She kept her rosary in one hand and a cloth soaked in carbolic in the other. They visited over 80 homes in 10 days, treating the sick, delivering laudanum, and whispering prayers for the dying. At night, they wept together in silence. By November, even the healthy feared to breathe. The city council ordered all public, gatherings suspended, schools closed, churches barred their doors. Theatres stood empty, posters fading in the rain. Funeral processions were limited to 3 mourners, masked and silent. But even these measures were shadows against a storm. The flu did not care for caution. It thrived in silence, in the breath between words, in the kindness of a shared cup. In the cold, close quarters of Halifax, it bloomed like frost on a window pane. Still, some found ways to endure. Mrs. Anara Khoury, a widow from Damascus, had come to Halifax a decade earlier with her 3 sons. She had lost her husband to pneumonia the previous winter and ran a small stall selling figs and pine nuts at the market. When the flu came, she shuttered her stall and turned her kitchen into a sick room. She brewed mint tea by the gallon, boiled water with cloves, rubbed her boys' chests with camphor and honey. One by one, they sickened. She did not sleep. She sang lullabies in Arabic and wept when they could not hear her. But one by one, they recovered. Her tea, her touch, her prayers, whether by faith or fate, brought them through. When asked later how she had endured, she only said, "God does not forget mothers." By December, the tide began to turn, not because the flu had vanished, but because it had taken what it could. The first wave, the worst wave, had swept through like fire. Bodies had burned on pyres when coffins ran out. Doctors fell ill. Priests collapsed mid-prayer. But somehow, Halifax remained, scorched, scarred, but breathing. A bell tolled softly on Christmas Eve. Just one. No carolers sang that year, but candles flickered in every window, tiny beacons of survival. And in the harbour, where ships once brought only dread, a small boat arrived bearing oranges, wool, and letters from abroad. Life, though cautious, resumed. Dr. Langley, frail now and grey, stood on the dock as snow began to fall. Beside him, Sister Agnes held a basket of scarves for the orphans left behind. They had survived, but neither would ever forget. Tonight, we leave Halifax behind. The docks have grown quiet, the sea is still, the breath of the dead is gone from the wind, and though mourning clings to the city like salt, there is peace in its stillness. In our next chapter, we will journey to a country churchyard where the flu met faith and where communities grieved in chorus. But for now, rest your thoughts and sleep as gently as the sea rocks a ship. It was a Sunday morning in mid-November 1918, and the pews of St. Thomas's parish stood silent. Located in a modest farming village nestled between the hedgerows of Dorset, England, St. Thomas's had for generations been the heart of its people. Its bell tower rose above the fields like a watchful shepherd. It rang for births, for weddings, for deaths, and each Sunday it summoned the faithful through the misty lanes to gather in worship. But now, the bell no longer rang, not since the vicar had died. Reverend Elliot Pembroke had served St. Thomas's for nearly 40 years. A tall man with a gentle face, he had once played the fiddle in his youth and could recite entire psalms from memory. To the villagers, he was not merely clergy, he was friend, counsellor, and the bearer of sacred rhythm. When the influenza crept into the village in late October, he did what he had always done. He visited the sick, bringing soup and scripture, walking house to house with a Bible under his arm and a scarf over his mouth. He refused to stop, even as his voice grew hoarse and his hands trembled. He gave his final sermon through a shuttered window, whispering the Gospel of John to a dying woman as her family wept behind her. He died the next day. With the vicar gone, the village was adrift. There was no one to bury the dead, save for the gravedigger, Thomas Webb, a quiet man who'd once lost a child and now worked with the steadiness of sorrow. There were no more hymns, no choirs, only the wind through the branches and the slow thud of shovels against earth. By mid-November, the churchyard had grown crowded. Wooden crosses, hastily carved, marked the new graves. Some bore names, others did not. A few were for entire families, and yet, amidst the mourning, the villagers began to gather. Not inside the church, but outside, on the slope of the churchyard hill. Each Sunday morning, they came silently. Men removed their caps. Women held handkerchiefs over their mouths. Children clutched dolls and buttons. They stood in loose circles, 6 feet apart or more, facing the cold stone of St. Thomas's with eyes half lowered. No one spoke at first. Then, on the first frostbitten morning of Advent, Mrs. Ethel Montgomery, a seamstress with a voice once praised in the county choir, began to hum. Just a hum, low and wavering, a note of longing. Others joined. They did not form harmonies. They did not dare to sing words, but the hum became a song in itself, half prayer, half memory, a murmur that rose and fell like breath, as if the village itself sighed with them. The song became a ritual. By the third week, they called it the Quiet Choir. They came not just from the village, but from nearby hamlets. People brought candles and set them on the stone wall. Some knelt. Some stood the entire time, faces lifted to the grey heavens. No leader directed them. No service was printed. But always the humming began. They hummed Abide With Me. They hummed all things bright and beautiful. They hummed Nearer, My God, to Thee. And then they went home. The church remained closed, but its presence remained undeniable. Inside, the pews gathered. Dust, cobwebs draped the pulpit like lace. The altar flowers had long since wilted. Yet the space held memory, and the villagers believed the spirits of their loved ones lingered in the sanctuary, waiting for the day the doors would open again. They did not rush it. Instead, they wove new traditions, ones not dependent on walls or windows. One such tradition began with a girl named Hannah Fairley. She was just 9 years old, her hair the colour of wheat at dusk. Her father, a wheelwright, had succumbed to the flu in the span of 3 days, leaving her mother near mute with grief. Hannah, uncertain what to do with her sorrow, began placing pressed flowers on the graves each morning. Pansies, thistles, snowdrops. She laid them in patterns, sometimes a heart, sometimes a cross, sometimes just a circle. Others noticed, and soon the churchyard bloomed again, not with tulips or crocuses, but with bits of colour upon cold stone, little bursts of hope. One Sunday, as the snow began to threaten, something remarkable occurred. The bell rang, just once. It startled the village. Doors opened, curtains parted, people emerged from their cottages, blinking into the pale morning. At the churchyard they found Thomas Webb standing by the bell rope, his hands shaking. He'd gone inside, just once, to see if it still worked. His eyes were red. He didn't speak, but the message was clear. St. Thomas's had not forgotten them, nor had God. By the close of December, the flu's grip had begun to loosen. Fewer new graves appeared. The coughs grew less common. The quiet choir, though still humming, added a little more strength to their voices. And when the snow finally came, deep and powdery and pure, the children built angels in it, their laughter echoing once more through the bare trees. The church would reopen in the spring. A new vicar would arrive. But even then, the quiet choir continued. Long after hymns returned to the nave, the humming became a symbol, not of silence, but of togetherness, a way to remember, a way to grieve, gently. And so, beneath the yew trees and between the weathered stones, the village of St. Thomas's mourned with grace and healed. Now, dear friend, let the hush of the choir follow you into your dreams. Let the wind carry those soft, wordless songs through your thoughts like feathers on a breeze. In our next chapter, we shall follow the footsteps of a young nurse in Paris, a woman who stood at the edge of despair and chose instead to stand in service. But tonight we rest and remember. In the final days of 1918, as snow gathered gently on the balconies of Montmartre and the River Seine flowed like a ribbon of ghostlight through the heart of Paris, a young woman named Céleste Fournier walked the cobbled streets with a lantern in one hand and a satchel in the other. She was 23. She had never kissed a man. She had never ridden a bicycle, but she had watched over more dying faces than she could count. Céleste was not meant to be a nurse. She had grown up among seamstresses and bakers, learning to knead bread and embroider linens with little roses and curlicues. Her mother, Geneviève, had once danced with the Paris Opera Ballet, and her father had run a bookshop on Rue de la Tombe Issoire until tuberculosis took him in the spring of 1914. The war took her brothers, and the flu took her mother. By the time November came, Céleste had nothing left but her hands and her courage, and so she gave both to the Hôtel Dieu hospital. The hospital was old, older than memory, they said. Stone arches framed its corridors, and ivy clung to its outer walls as though trying to hold the building upright. Inside, the air was thick with camphor and despair. There were no spare beds. Cots filled every corner. Sheets were thin and often damp. Nurses were few. Doctors overworked, and the sick. They came by the hour. It was not a hospital. It was a shipwreck, and Céleste became a lifeboat. Each night, she lit her lantern and walked the wards. She whispered to the patients, calling them by name even if they could no longer answer. She changed bandages, wiped sweat from brows, spooned broth into dry mouths. She never raised her voice, never turned away. When a man thrashed in fevered fear, she pressed her hand to his chest and sang a lullaby she barely remembered from childhood. The patients called her l'ange de la nuit, the angel of the night. She did not feel like an angel. She felt like a thread pulled thin. One evening, in late November, Céleste was assigned to the quarantine wing. It was the worst of all, the last refuge for those too sick to save, where coughs echoed like cannon fire and breath turned to blood. Most nurses dreaded it. Few lasted long, but Céleste entered without hesitation. There, among the flickering gas lamps and the rustle of fevered sheets, she found a boy no older than 16. He had been brought in from the outskirts, a coal miner's son, pale as candle wax and barely conscious. No one knew his name. He became Jean, because that was her father's name. Jean spoke only once, as she changed his linens and dabbed his lips, with rose water, He opened his eyes, looked at her as if from the far end of a tunnel, and whispered, "Will it hurt?" She paused, then knelt beside him. Her hand was cold, but her voice was warm. "No, mon petit, you are going to fly." "Fly?" he asked, with the faintest smile. "Yes," she said. "Over the rooftops, over the moon, past the stars. It will feel like dreaming." He closed his eyes again, and he did not wake. Celeste sat with him until dawn. She wrote Jeanne on a small tag and tucked it beside his collar. Then she folded his hands, placed a lavender sprig between his fingers, and lit a candle in his memory. She did not weep. Her tears had run out weeks ago, but inside her chest, something shifted, a deep, quiet ache that could not be named. Outside, Paris continued. The armistice had been signed on November 11th, and the boulevards had filled with parades and music. Soldiers danced with girls in silk gloves. Banners waved. Wine was spilled. It was peace, they said, but Celeste walked through the revelry like a ghost. Peace had come for the guns, but the flu still whispered through the alleys. And in her lanterns, soft glow, she saw the faces no one celebrated. Yet not all was sorrow. One morning, while tending to an elderly bookseller named Monsieur Devienne, she found a battered copy of Les Miserables beneath his pillow. The pages were brittle, the cover half-torn. He told her, with a dry chuckle, that he had read the chapter of Fantine every night since his wife died. "Do you read?" he asked. "I used to," she replied softly. He gave her the book. She read it that night, by candlelight, and the words, those heavy, beautiful words, wrapped themselves around her tired heart like a quilt. Spring arrived earlier in Paris that year. By March, the number of new cases dwindled, the beds emptied. The scent of bleach began to give way to the scent of blooming hyacinths in the hospital garden. Celeste, thin as a wisp and pale as milk, walked those garden paths with a cup of tea in her hand and the faintest smile on her lips. She had survived, not unscarred, not untouched, but alive. She never married. She never left the city. But every year, on November 1st, she placed a single white rose on the steps of the Hôtel Dieu, not in mourning, but in gratitude for the strength she didn't know she possessed, for the patience she remembered by name, for the voice of a boy who asked if it would hurt. She became a nurse for the rest of her days, and every night, as sleep claimed her, she imagined herself walking the wards again, lantern glowing, heart steady, soul soft, just as she had when the world was silent. Now, dear listener, as you drift deeper into the night, picture her light flickering through the darkened halls of that old Paris hospital. Let her quiet courage guide you into sleep. In our next chapter, we shall travel across the ocean to a railroad town in the American Midwest, where the flu forced neighbors to turn away from one another, and yet, from that separation, a strange kind of unity was born. But tonight, rest, and remember the lantern. Iron Hill, Nebraska, was not much to look at. A grain elevator, a post office, 2 churches, and one long, dusty main street that ended where the cornfields began. The railroad ran straight through it, east to west, a spine of steel that carried freight and mail, and eventually, death. To those who lived there in 1918, the town was both cradle and cage. There was little reason to leave, even less reason to expect the world to find you. But in the last weeks of October, the world came anyway, riding the westbound train in a boxcar of coughing men. The first case was a conductor named Joel Hobson. He was well liked, known for his booming laugh and the gold watch he kept tucked in his vest pocket. When he staggered into the Iron Hill depot late one Tuesday evening, pale and gasping, the station master thought he was drunk. By sunrise, Joel was dead. The town doctor, Ira Meeks, examined the body and called it influenza. He told the undertaker to bury the man quickly and warned the mayor, Harold Gantz, to prepare. Prepare for what? Gantz asked. For everything to stop, Meeks replied. The town council met in the schoolhouse that night. They were not city men. They were farmers, tradesmen, church deacons, men who had built this town with their hands. Closing it down, even for a few weeks, felt like surrender. But Meeks was persuasive. So Iron Hill became a divided town. The west side, home to the depot, the grain silos and the boarding houses, was barricaded with hay bales and hand-painted signs. No entry, fever zone. Residents were told to remain indoors. Trains could stop for cargo, but passengers could not disembark. The east side, where the churches and general store stood, remained open, at first, until the children started coughing. By the 1st of November, the schools had shuttered. Sundays were silent. The bell at St. Andrew's did not ring. Sermons were printed on leaflets and left in baskets outside the church, weighed down with stones. Pastor Landry, himself recovering from a mild case, wrote his blessings in ink instead of voice. People stopped shaking hands, stopped visiting neighbours, stopped sharing casseroles and gossip. The town grew still. Mrs. Belinda Gantz, the mayor's wife, took to sewing cloth masks from old curtains. She left them in bundles on porch steps with notes written in perfect cursive. God keep you. Cover your face. We are together, even apart. She made over 400 in total. Children helped. They weren't allowed to gather, but they wrote notes on scraps of brown paper, little messages of hope and humour, and tucked them into the folds of the masks. One read, "Wear this, or you'll smell like cow pies forever." It was signed, Simply Billy, age 8. Meanwhile, on the west side, life was darker. The boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Lila Denvers, became an impromptu infirmary. Her tenants, mostly rail workers and drifters, sickened one by one. She did what she could. Boiled water, burned herbs, placed hot stones under blankets. But she was no nurse. The doctor, too busy and cautious, rarely crossed the barricade. She buried 4 men herself, wrapping them in bed sheets and laying them to rest beyond the apple orchard under rough wooden markers. She prayed over each one, and when she caught the fever herself, she prepared a letter, scrawled in shaking hand. Tell, them I tried, but she survived. When she emerged from her sickbed in mid-November, her hair was streaked with grey, and her hands trembled. But she opened her doors again, not for business, for refuge. 3 orphans from the neighbouring farm had nowhere to go. Their parents had died days apart. Lila took them in, fed them porridge, and let them sleep in the guest room, beneath quilts she had sewn in better times. One of the children, Nellie, asked her, "Are you our mother now?" Lila smiled faintly. "No, sweetheart," she whispered, "but I will keep you safe." Mayor Gantz, meanwhile, patrolled the barricade daily. He kept a notebook in his pocket, tracking cases, noting supplies, coordinating with the few still healthy shopkeepers to arrange food deliveries. He wore his mask, though it irritated his nose. He didn't speak much. His own son had fallen ill. 17-year-old Lawrence, who'd just been accepted to a college in Chicago, lay in bed upstairs, drifting in and out of delirium. Gantz's wife sat with him every hour. When the boy finally stirred and asked, "Is the war over yet?" his father wept. By Thanksgiving, Iron Hill was a ghost of its former self. There was no church service, no family gatherings, but each household lit a candle in their front window that evening, a silent signal of gratitude, not for abundance, but for survival. From the hills beyond town, the glow looked like stars had fallen to earth. The flu receded, as mysteriously as it had come. By mid-December, the barricade came down. The town reunited, slowly and cautiously. Children returned, to the yards, though they looked thinner. The general store reopened, though shelves were bare, and Lila Denvers, widow and caregiver, was named the town's first honorary councilwoman, an act unheard of at the time. She wore her best black dress and spoke just one sentence: "We lost much, but we did not lose each other." Iron Hill would never forget that season of silence. Each year after, on October 31st, they held a lantern vigil on the tracks. Families gathered to place candles inside hollowed gourds and set them along the railway line. The candles flickered in rows, a river of light. No speeches, no songs, just remembrance. Tonight, let the train whistle fade into your dreams, soft as wind across wheat. Let the candles of Iron Hill glow gently in your thoughts, and rest. In our next part, we shall enter the cramped world of a tenement building in New York City, where immigrants fought not only illness, but invisibility. But for now, sleep well. The worst has passed, for now. In 1918, New York City was a beast of breath and brick. It heaved with movement, streetcars groaning, children chasing each other between pushcarts, horses clopping, fire bells ringing, vendors calling out in Italian, Yiddish, Irish brogue. The Mayo, Lower East Side in particular, was a web of noise and closeness. Whole families lived in single rooms, divided only by curtains or bed sheets. Windows opened onto alleyways. Light came at a premium. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. And then came the flu. On Hester Street, in a narrow 5-story tenement, the Epstein family lived in apartment 3B. 6 of them, all in 2 rooms. Chaim Epstein worked as a tailor in a shop below Canal Street. His wife, Miriam, kept house and took in laundry when she could. Their children, Ruthie, Esther, and the twins, shared a straw mattress and whispered stories to one another at night, giggling under the quilt their grandmother had brought from Minsk. On October 7th, Ruthie came home from school with a fever. By October 10th, every child in the household had it. There were no hospitals nearby that had space. The closest, Bellevue, was already triaging patients in hallways. Doctors did what they could, which often meant not enough. Neighbours offered lemon peel and mustard plasters, and one old man brought a jar of vinegar with garlic cloves floating inside. Still, Esther's breathing grew shallow. And on the morning of October 14th, she died. She was 8 years old. There was no time to mourn. There was no space to hold grief in a place where every square foot mattered. Her body was placed in a makeshift wooden box, carried down the fire escape by Chaim and a cousin. The rabbi had too many dead to pray over, so Miriam whispered psalms herself, lighting a small candle by the kitchen sink and tucking a doll beside Esther's pillow, as if she were simply asleep. She told the younger twins that Esther had gone to visit their grandmother. They didn't ask where that was. Meanwhile, outside their walls, the city wheezed. Entire neighborhoods fell into quiet. Not stillness, New York never stilled, but a kind of breathless hush. The trolley lines ran, but mostly empty. Factories opened late and closed early. Bread lines grew, longer, and the faces in them more sunken. On the tenement rooftops, people laid out their sick beneath the open sky, hoping fresh air might do what medicine could not. Bedrolls, quilts, pillows, all carried up the narrow staircases to meet the wind. It helped some. Others died under the stars. 1 floor above the Epsteins lived the Gianettis, 4 brothers and their aging mother. They rarely spoke to the Epsteins, save for the occasional nod on the stairs. But during the worst week of October, when Chaim fell ill and Miriam could barely lift a kettle, Mrs. Gianetti sent down warm soup in a dented copper pot. She said nothing. She left it at their door and tapped once with her knuckles. Inside was barley, potato, and a bit of chicken, boiled until the bones had turned soft. Even in a building bursting with fear, kindness climbed the walls. Children wrote chalk messages on stoops. Get well, Mr. Feldstein. Pray for Nona. Don't forget to wash your hands. A teenage girl named Aviva Goldberg organized a mask-making circle from behind the bakery. She used old flour sacks and stitched them by candlelight. She handed them out for free. 1 for every tenant. Wear this, she said, or Bubby will haunt you. People laughed for the first time in days. Still, the city mourned. The streets saw more funerals than weddings. Cart drivers hauled away bodies wrapped in sheets, and churches held services with only 4 or 5 mourners, spaced apart, masked, their hands gripping prayer books wrapped in cloth. But there was no time for deep grief. Life in the tenements required movement. Water had to be boiled. Clothes had to be washed in basins. Wood had to be chopped for small stoves. Children had to be quieted. And so, the sorrow became something quieter. Something folded into the corners of the home like a hidden handkerchief. By November, as cases began to slow, the Epsteins dared to open their front window again. Fresh air drifted in. Chime, thinner but alive, began sewing again. Simple patches for winter coats. Miriam hummed as she boiled lentils. The children, quieter now, played with string and buttons on the floor. And on the shelf above the stove sat a framed photograph of Esther, taken the previous spring at a picnic in Central Park. She wore a ribbon in her hair. They left the candle burning beside her frame for 7 days. Then, on the 8th, Miriam blew it out. Life resumed. Not the same life. Not with the same laughter, but a life nonetheless. The tenement remained crowded, but the walls had heard stories now, stories of loss, of sacrifice, of soup passed between neighbours, and even after the world forgot what had happened, the people inside those brick walls remembered. Years later, Ruthie, now grown, would walk past the building with her own daughter. "This is where I grew up," she would say. And when the child asked, "Was it happy?" she would smile softly and say, "Sometimes." Then she would add, "And sometimes we just tried to stay alive." Now, as sleep approaches, let the sound of distant streetcars fade in your mind. Imagine the glow of a kitchen lamp behind a 3rd-story window. Picture soup steam curling into the air and the soft hush of a mother's whisper. The walls remember. Let them guard your dreams tonight. In our next part, we will visit the cold expanse of northern Canada, where Indigenous communities faced the flu with ancient strength and suffered silently when the outside world failed them. But for now, rest easy and breathe. The first snow fell early in the winter of 1918. It dusted the pine needles in silence, blanketed the roofs of log homes, and lay gently atop frozen rivers where the moonlight shimmered like trapped breath. In the Dean village of Souquet, tucked deep into the boreal forests of northern Canada, the only sound was the soft creak of trees swaying in the wind. There was no telegraph, no train, no roads leading in, and yet somehow the sickness still found them. Souquet had survived many winters. The people there knew hardship. They knew hunger. They knew cold. But they also knew the land. They followed the caribou. They tracked the fish. They spoke to the wind as if it were an old friend. Generations had thrived in this place through respect, rhythm, and the knowledge passed by elders who spoke little and saw much. But no one had ever seen a sickness like this. It began when a trading canoe arrived from the south. 2 men, Pierre, Laval, a Métis trapper, and a French clerk from the Hudson's Bay Company, brought goods, mail, and a bottle of whiskey to warm their bones. They stayed only 2 nights in the cabin at the edge of the village. The Frenchman coughed but waved it off as smoke from the fire. By the time they paddled away, 5 villagers were coughing too, and within a week, the healer, old woman Tall Willow, had burned all her herbs in prayer and desperation. There was no doctor, no medicine. The people did what they had always done. They boiled spruce tips, burned sweetgrass, wrapped hot stones in birch bark and placed them by the sick. The women sang the ancient songs, the ones meant to carry spirits gently to the next world. But the fever showed no mercy. Elders passed quietly in the night. Children followed soon after. Entire families vanished in a matter of days. And the village, once filled with the smoke of fires and the laughter of hunters, fell into eerie stillness. Among the sick was a boy named Ashka. He was 12, curious and lean, known for climbing trees higher than anyone else dared. When the cough found him, he said nothing. He wrapped himself in a caribou hide blanket and watched the snow fall outside his family's longhouse, his breath thin and uneven. His grandmother, who had lost 3 daughters to childbirth and her husband to a bear, refused to leave his side. She sat by him night after night, telling stories in whispers, her fingers stroking his brow. "Do not be afraid of pain," she said. "Pain is the hawk, but you are the pine." One morning, Ashka stirred. His fever broke. His eyes opened, and though his limbs were weak, he smiled, a small, tired smile. It was enough. His grandmother wept without sound, cradling his face with hands worn from winters beyond counting. Of all her kin, he alone remained. Others were not so fortunate. By early December, more than half the village was gone. The chief lit a ceremonial fire, not for a feast or a naming, but to honor the dead. He placed into the flames a deerskin bundle containing cedar, fur, feathers, and ashes from the homes of those lost. As the smoke rose, it spiraled skyward, silent, sacred, final. The survivors watched in reverent silence. They did not speak of the dead by name, not yet. To do so would be to bind them to this world, and now they must be free. When the government agents finally arrived weeks later, on snowshoes with sled dogs and rifles slung over their shoulders, they found a village hollowed by sorrow. They offered quinine and canned milk. They asked how many had died. No one answered. Instead, the chief gave them a single object, a carved stone shaped like a bird in flight. It bore no inscription, only the image of wings. "What does it mean?" one officer asked. The chief, his voice low, replied, "It means they are gone." In the weeks that followed, the survivors began to rebuild. Not quickly, not eagerly, but with ritual and care. Snow was cleared from the graves. New caches were built for food. The drummers met again in the Circle Lodge, where they struck the hide with open palms, not to summon spirits, but to call the living back to rhythm. Ashka walked again. His breath was short, but his eyes held winter stars. He was no longer a boy, not truly. He helped carve the memorial to the lost, a ring of pine poles surrounding the oldest spruce tree at the village's edge. Around its base, they hung pouches of feathers, berries, and beads, each representing a soul returned to the sky. When asked how many pouches were needed, no one gave a number. Numbers, like names, had become too heavy. Years later, when planes flew overhead and roads were carved into the land, Tsuke still bore the quiet scars of that winter. The forest had grown back, but memory does not rot like wood. It lingers in the song of the owl, the hush of snowfall, the whisper of wind between trees, and in that hush, the story remains. Now, as you lay in the softness of night, picture the pines heavy with snow, the stars wheeling above the northern sky, and the warmth of one grandmother's hand against a fevered brow. Let the silence of Tsuke calm your breath and sleep. In the next part, we shall find ourselves in the midst of a battlefield hospital in Belgium, where the war was ending, but another war within the body had just begun. But tonight, drift gently, and remember the wings carved in stone. The war was ending. That is what they said in hushed tones as November 1918 approached. The guns were quieting. The trenches, those scars upon the earth, no longer roared. Flags were raised, treaties whispered, and newspapers filled their pages with hope. But not in Ward 17. Ward 17 of the field hospital near Ypres, Belgium, did not know peace. It knew only the sound of shallow breathing. The hospital had once been a stone barn, its beams thick with soot and old hay. Now, it housed the forgotten and the failing, the men who had survived bullets, shrapnel, and fire only to fall to something smaller, stranger, and more cruel. The flu had arrived a month earlier, carried not by enemy troops, but by messengers, engineers, and supply clerks. The same hands that delivered rations had delivered death, and here, at the edge of war, it found its final feast. Corporal Miles Redfern had seen 4 winters in the trenches. He had survived gas attacks, frostbite, and a bayonet wound that nearly took his leg. He had not written home in 3 weeks, not since the fever began. Now, he lay still on a cot beside a broken wall, his breath rattling with every exhale. His eyes stared at the rafters as if they held answers. His lips were blue. Beside him sat Private Godfrey Wills, a clerk from Leeds who had never seen a battlefield. He had come to the front to file papers and write casualty reports. Now he read psalms aloud in a whisper, his voice trembling. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow." His throat tightened. Miles did not respond. Nurse Ellen, Ward moved quietly between the beds. Her boots were worn thin, the leather cracked from rain and blood. She had been there since 1915, through bombardments, through shell shock, through cholera. But this invisible storm, was different. She could not stop it. She could not even slow it. The masks she wore were made of gauze soaked in eucalyptus oil. She changed them every 2 hours, though it hardly mattered. She was the only nurse left in Ward 17. The others had fallen ill or been transferred. The doctor, Major Rooks, had died 4 days earlier. A candle still burned in his empty office. Now, it was just her and the priest. Father Etienne Charbonneau was a thin man with hollow cheeks and a voice like winter rain. He walked the aisles of the ward barefoot, as was his habit, speaking softly in French and Latin to the dying. He gave last rites with fingers stained from ink and fever. He rarely wept, but he did sing. Each night, before the lanterns were dimmed, he sang a lullaby, an old Breton hymn once sung to him by his mother. The words meant, "Sleep now, little soldier, the battle is done." Some men smiled in their sleep when they heard it, others did not wake at all. Outside, the sky turned grey, with the rot of autumn, shell craters filled with rainwater. Rats darted between piles of boots and bandages, and still, the wind carried whispers. The war is ending. The war is ending. But inside Ward 17, no one cheered. The war had not ended for them. It had simply changed its name. On November 11th, at suff 11 minutes past 11, the guns fell silent. Across France and Belgium, men stood from trenches, shook hands, and sobbed into their helmets. Flags were raised. Champagne was opened. Prisoners were freed. In the field hospital, Ellen stood by the cot of Corporal Miles Redfern and held his hand as the bells rang in the village beyond. He did not hear them. He had died 20 minutes earlier. She did not cry. Instead, she took the letter from his pocket, the one he had meant to send home to his sister, and read it aloud in the cold light of morning. Her voice was steady, slow. "My dearest Gwen, the frost has returned. I think of our walk by the river and how you picked daisies even when the ground was hard. Do you remember?" She paused, folded the letter, placed it atop his chest. Then she moved on to the next bed. By the end of November, only 5 men remained in Ward 17. The others were buried in rows outside, their graves marked not by crosses, but by pieces of shell casing hammered into the soil. Ellen carved their names with the point of a scalpel, her hands blistered but unwavering. The priest blessed them each with his last bottle of holy water. When it ran out, he used rain. Ellen would remain in Belgium for 2 more years. She stayed, through the cleanup, through the tribunals, through the return of soldiers to homes changed forever. She never married, never returned to the countryside where she was born. Instead, She returned every November to the broken barn that had been Ward 17. She planted violets along the outer wall, not in rows, in circles, because, she said, grief is not a straight path. Years later, a boy would ask her, "Did you fight in the war?" And she would smile, worn and quiet, and say, "No, dear, I simply listened to the men who did." Then she would hum the Breton hymn, and the room would grow still. Tonight, let your dreams carry you past the broken fields of Belgium. Let the lullaby of the priest echo softly in your heart, and the candle of the nurse light the path through the night. Tomorrow we will walk the streets of San Francisco, where masks became protest, and fear became fury. But tonight, rest beneath the hush of war's end, and sleep. San Francisco, in the autumn of 1918, was a city veiled twice over, once by the thick sea fog that swept in from the Pacific, and again by the soft white gauze that now adorned nearly every face. It began quietly, as most things did during the pandemic. A few cases reported in October, then dozens, then hundreds. Doctors urged caution. Hospitals began to fill, and on October 18th, the city took action. The Board of Health issued a decree that would define the days to come. All persons shall wear a mask covering the nose and mouth while in public. For a city that had survived earthquakes and firestorms, the order seemed, at first, a small price to pay. San Franciscans took to their sewing machines. Gauze and muslin were in short supply almost immediately. Children wore handkerchiefs tied behind their ears. Shopgirls pinned lace across their lips. Men cut slits in their masks to slip through. Cigarettes. The local Red Cross handed out masks by the hundreds at train stations, street corners, and church steps. A sense of purpose briefly united the city. "We're all in this together," read the signs posted on lampposts. For a time, the masks became a badge, not of fear, but of shared resolve. Among the masked walked Caroline Havers, a widow of the 1906 quake, who now volunteered with the Women's Defense League. She wore her late husband's watch pinned to her coat and carried stacks of cloth masks in her arms each morning. With gloved fingers, she handed them out on Market Street, never asking for coin, only offering a firm nod and a simple phrase: "For your neighbour, for yourself." To some, she became known as the Mask Mother. To others, she was a busybody, but she did not care what they called her. She had buried too many to indulge in pride. Still, not all were willing. Some San Franciscans chafed beneath the law. They complained that the masks were stifling, that they made it hard to breathe or speak. Some claimed the masks were ineffective. Others, that they were un-American. A barber on Howard Street refused to wear his altogether and was fined $5. He paid in pennies and declared he would rather choke on smog than gauze. What began as grumbling soon gathered force. In late November, the Anti-Mask League formed, a civic protest movement made up of lawyers, libertarians, and a few prominent women's rights activists who argued that the mandate violated personal liberty. They held public meetings, printed leaflets, published open letters in the San Francisco Chronicle. One declared, "No law shall command me to fear my own breath." Dr. William Hassler, the city's chief health officer, stood firm. He reminded citizens that the masks were a barrier of compassion, not control. But the tide of resentment was rising. On January 25th, 1919, amid mounting pressure and declining infection rates, the city lifted the mask mandate. Church bells rang. Cheers rose along the Embarcadero. Mask bonfires were lit in alleyways and backyards. Children leapt and danced, but not all joined the celebration. Caroline Havers kept her mask on. So did many in the city's Chinatown, where memories of exclusion laws still clung to the corners like soot. The elders there remembered too well how quickly public sympathy could curdle into blame. Then, in early February, the flu returned, not with a trumpet blast, but with a sigh. A few new cases, then dozens. Then a wave that surged through the very streets where bonfires of gauze had so recently burned. Hospitals filled again. Coffins were in short supply once more. This time, the city did not reimpose the mandate. The Anti-Mask League, now disbanded, offered no further statements, and the people of San Francisco were left to mourn in silence. Among the dead was Thomas Bell, a conductor for the Market Street Railway. He had once laughed at the mask ordinance, calling it pajama, cloth for cowards. His wife Miriam had stitched him a fine mask of blue cotton with white stars. He wore it for one day. He died on February 14th. At his funeral, Miriam wore her mask again, tied so tightly that it left bruises behind her ears. She never removed it, not even when they lowered him into the ground. Nurse Abigail Lynn saw the second wave coming before it arrived. She had watched the city breathe too quickly, too hopefully. In her ward on Bush Street, she moved like a ghost, careful, deliberate, and always with a mask. Her patients called her Quiet Angel, for she never raised her voice, only pressed cool cloths to fevered skin and whispered prayers in Cantonese. When a reporter asked her, weeks later, what she thought of the anti-mask protests, she only said, "I think kindness is harder to breathe without." By March, the worst had passed. San Francisco exhaled again, this time more slowly. Businesses reopened, not with celebration, but caution. The city counted its dead and made no speeches. Caroline Havers folded her last mask and placed it in a velvet-lined box beside her husband's watch. Abigail Lynn wrote a letter to her younger sister in Guangdong, describing the way silence had become the city's new anthem, and Miriam Bell stood once more at the grave of her husband, a fresh mask tucked in her pocket, just in case. Years later, a child would find one of those old masks folded inside a family Bible. "Why did they wear these?" she asked. Her grandmother only replied, "Because sometimes the bravest thing we could do was cover our face." Tonight, as sleep begins to draw near, let the sound of the Pacific foghorn lull your thoughts. Picture the city beneath mist, lanterns swaying, footsteps muffled. Picture the softness of gauze against cheek and the quiet defiance of those who wore their care like cloth. Let the masks drift from memory into dreams. In our next part, we shall walk a muddy road in rural Ireland where a mail carrier became the last thread of connection for a village on the brink of forgetting itself. But now, sleep. Breathe easy. You are safe. The road to Kilfeather Hill was little more than a ribbon of mud and stone, winding between hedgerows of thorny gorse and rust-coloured bracken. It curved over green slopes and vanished into fog most mornings, the kind of path only known by memory and the rhythm of one's feet. To walk it in 1918 was to feel utterly alone. And yet, each morning, rain or shine, frost or thaw, Postman Aidan Kerrigan laced his worn boots, buttoned his wool coat, and shouldered his leather satchel. He had been delivering letters across County Sligo for 17 years, but he had never carried so many condolences. Kilfeather was a scattered village, a cluster of stone cottages, a church with a broken bell, and a pub that hadn't poured a pint in months. The people there were farmers mostly, men and women carved by wind and hunger, still whispering the old Gaelic prayers under their breath. By the time the flu reached them, the World War had already stolen 5 sons and 2 fathers. But the sickness did not come with trumpets or telegrams. It came with a single, innocent letter, posted from Dublin. Aidan remembered the envelope clearly. Thin paper, feminine script, a faint scent of lavender. It had been addressed to a Mrs. Marie Duffy, widow, who lived just past the churchyard, with her 2 daughters. He had slipped the letter through the crack beneath her door on a misty October morning. By the following week, both daughters had taken ill. By the next, Mered herself could no longer stand. Aidan brought her soup, unasked, left it on the doorstep beside his usual bundle of mail. He heard her whisper through the door, "God reward you." He never saw her again. The village doctor had gone south in September and never returned. So the people of Kilfeather turned to each other. They burned turf fires day and night, hung sprigs of elder above their doors, boiled water with thyme and rosemary. They sang softly in Gaelic to the sick, believing that melody could carry pain away. But the flu cared little for song. By November's end, 23 of Kilfeather's 72 residents had died. Aidan carried their last words in envelopes stamped and sealed by trembling hands. He delivered wills, farewells, and final blessings. He became the voice of those who could no longer speak. One of those letters was addressed to young Niall Hanratty, just 12 years old. He lived alone in a turf-roofed cottage on the edge of the bog, his mother having passed in the second week of November. His father was in France, unaware of the boy's new silence. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried all the way from a cousin in Limerick. Aidan didn't knock. Niall no longer answered. Instead, the postman left the envelope beside a piece of bread and a tin of condensed milk. He returned 3 days later. The letter was gone. The food was untouched. Inside, he found Niall curled beneath a blanket, fevered and mumbling. Aidan stayed that night, made a fire, boiled water, read the boy stories from the Bible until his shivering slowed. The next morning, Niall opened his eyes and whispered, "I dreamed of my ma. She was singing to me." Aidan nodded. "She still is, lad." From that day forward, Aidan became more than a postman. He was cook, caretaker, gravedigger. He fetched water, chopped wood, delivered herbs. He stitched masks from potato sacks and taught the children to tie them properly. He brought books, rosaries, dried apples, and still, he carried the letters. So many letters. In early December, a parcel arrived from overseas, an unexpected package from New York, wrapped in brown paper, addressed to Mrs. Bernadette Kavanagh, whose husband had died of fever only a week before. Inside was a photograph of her son, Seamus, in uniform, smiling in front of a row of American Red Cross tents. There was a letter too, written in blocky English. "I am alive. I think of you every day. Hold on, I will come home." Aidan delivered it himself. He stood beside Bernadette as she read it, her hands trembling, her eyes wet. Then he stepped outside and wept alone in the falling snow. By Christmas, the village was quiet. There were fewer chimneys smoking, fewer doors opening. But in the stillness, a strange kind of peace settled. The dying had passed. The sick were recovering. And the letters, those thin threads between lives, still came, bearing comfort, memory, and promise. On Christmas Eve, Aidan made one final delivery. He visited each home, slipping notes through cracks and leaving bundles of dried holly wrapped in paper. The notes were not official. They were his own. "You are remembered. The sun will rise. You are not alone." That night, he lit a lantern and walked to the highest point on Kilfeather Hill. There, amid the ancient stones and the silhouettes of sheep, he placed the lantern on a flat rock and let it glow through the fog. A signal for the living, for the dead, for anyone still wandering in the dark. Aidan Kerrigan died in 1935. He never married, never left Kilfeather. His boots were worn to the sole, and his satchel remained hanging by the fireplace until the end of his days. He was buried beneath a hawthorn tree beside the chapel. The plaque read simply, "Messenger of Hope, Postman of the People." But the letters he carried, the ones filled with sorrow and love, regret and resilience, remained folded in drawers, tucked in Bibles, pressed between the pages of books, never burned. Now, dear dreamer, let your thoughts walk with Aidan through those rain-swept fields. Let the rustle of paper be the lullaby. Let the path fade into sleep. Tomorrow, we shall listen to the bells of a convent, where nuns faced the flu with prayer and silence, and the world's chaos dared not enter their cloistered garden. But tonight, sleep as gently as a letter placed on a pillow. You are remembered. The convent bell rang softly each morning just before dawn. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The sound drifted through the corridors like mist, gently waking the sisters from their dreams. One by one, they rose from narrow beds, wrapped in woolen shawls, and stepped silently into the cold stone halls of Sainte Marie de Neige. The convent of St. Mary of the Snows had stood for over a century at the edge of the Jura Mountains in France, its white walls hidden behind cypress and yew. The world beyond had changed, wars had come and gone, but within those walls, time remained still, until the winter of 1918. They had heard whispers of the plague long before it reached them. Letters from Marseille spoke of death in the streets. A visiting priest warned them during confession, and then the abbess received the telegram from the bishop's office in Lyon. The hospital nearby was overwhelmed. The convent, known for its healing garden and the skills of its herbalist sisters, was asked to receive the overflow, not to send aid, not to pray from afar, but to open the gates. Reverend Mother Eloise did not hesitate. She was a tall woman with silver hair tucked beneath her veil and a gaze that held the weight of generations. When she read the letter to the assembled sisters in the chapter room, no one protested. No one wept. They simply bowed their heads and began to prepare. Beds were moved into the former schoolroom. Blankets were gathered. Dried herbs steeped in great pots. The still room filled with the scent of chamomile and rosemary. White linen was washed and sewn into masks, aprons and bandages. The garden, normally dormant in December, was blanketed in snow, but the sisters still gathered pine needles, juniper, and dried marjoram from the stores. They whispered over each preparation as though infusing it with sacred light. By the end of the week, the sick had arrived. 32 patients, pale, coughing, fevered. The gates of Sainte Marie closed behind them with a groan that echoed like the hinge of heaven. Sister Thérèse, only 21 and newly professed, had never seen a dying man before. She had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but no one had prepared her for this. The coughing was relentless. The blood on the linens impossible to scrub clean. She knelt beside a girl no older than herself, whose eyes were too wide, too afraid, and whose breath sounded like leaves in the wind. At night, she prayed for peace. In the morning, she made tea with trembling hands. By the end of the second week, she no longer trembled. The convent was no longer quiet. The chapel's silence was filled with whispered hymns, the rustle of bandages, the rattle of fever. The bell still rang, but now it marked more than the hours of prayer. It marked the passing of souls. Each evening, after Compline, the sisters carried the dead to the orchard, where a makeshift cemetery was prepared beneath the apple trees. They did not speak. They did not sing. They only laid them down, covered them in earth, and bowed. But not all was sorrow. In the stillness of one February afternoon, the snow melted just enough to reveal a bloom, a violet, small and brave, rising beside the old well. Sister Jeanne, the herbalist, spotted it during her rounds and gathered it carefully. She pressed it between the pages of the Psalter in the infirmary. The patients who were strong enough smiled when they saw it. A violet in winter, a miracle in miniature. By March, nearly all the sick had either recovered or gone to God. The last to recover was a German soldier named Matthias, left behind after being taken prisoner. He had refused to speak for weeks, but on the day his fever broke, he whispered, in halting French, "Why do you help me?" Sister Thérèse, now no longer frightened, looked at him steadily, because Christ does not ask which flag we march under. Reverend Mother Eloise herself fell ill not long after. The sisters watched over her with the same care she had taught them, reciting psalms at her bedside and steeping the strongest teas from the last of the winter herbs. She smiled even as her strength faded. "You have learned to serve with silence," she whispered. "Now learn to serve with song." She died just after Lord's, her hands clasped in prayer. The garden bloomed early that spring. In April, when the gates reopened, the bishop sent a letter of commendation. The convent was praised. The sisters offered their thanks, but they asked for no reward. Instead, they held a mass, not for the dead, but for endurance and for the unknown who had passed through their care like the wind through yew trees. Years later, pilgrims would visit the orchard. They would find the simple graves and kneel beside the apple trees. One might see a small stone marked only with a violet and read the inscription left by Sister Jeanne. We healed with hands, but we loved with silence. Now, dear listener, as the evening deepens and the world quiets, let your thoughts wander to the cloistered garden of Sainte Marie des Neiges. Let the scent of rosemary and the hush of prayers wrap around you like warm wool. The storm has passed the convent walls. The silence has returned. Let it cradle you into sleep. In the next part, we shall hear the voice of a young boy in Tokyo, where the flu arrived with the steamships and changed the rhythm of an ancient city. But for now, rest and remember the violet. In the winter of 1919, the lanterns of Tokyo flickered like paper stars against the dusk. They hung outside tea houses, above tatami-matted doorways, and along the narrow wooden bridges that crisscross the Sumida River. In the Ginza district, electric lights had begun to compete with tradition. But in the neighborhoods beyond, where stone walls curved around tiny gardens, the world still moved in time with the old seasons. It was there, in a modest house behind a plum orchard, that a boy named Ichiro lived with his grandmother. He was 8 years old. He had never seen snow until that year, and he had never known silence like the silence that followed the sickness. The influenza had come not with fire or thunder, but aboard steamships, floating cities that brought goods and travelers from across the sea. At first, it was the foreign districts that grew quiet. The dock workers vanished. The laundries stood idle. Men in suits coughed behind their gloves in Ueno Station, and women wore their kimono collars high around the face. Then the temples began to close. The schools followed, and Tokyo, so full of rhythm, of sellers shouting, children laughing, monks chanting, became a city of whispers. Ichiro noticed first when his neighbor, old Mr. Takamura, stopped sweeping the front step. Then he noticed that the man's window, usually open for birdsong, stayed shut for 5 days. On the 6th, the priest came, and the lantern at his door was lowered to half height. Ichiro asked his grandmother, "Why do they lower the lanterns?" She replied without looking up from her stitching, "To light the way for those who cannot return." His grandmother, Lady Mariko, was a woman of few words and much grace. She had once served in the household of a noble family before the war, and now spent her days making dolls for the nearby shrine. Her hair was silver, always in a bun. Her kimono sleeves fluttered like cranes as she moved. When the fever reached their street, she did not panic. She boiled water, hung charcoal packets above the doors, washed Ichiro's hands 3 times each day. She told him, "Fear is a louder sickness than the flu," so they moved through their days in quiet order. Even when the house beside theirs fell silent. Even when the doctor stopped coming. At night, Ichiro listened. He heard the cries of crows on the rooftops, the distant rattle of a wheelbarrow carrying someone too sick to walk, the solemn beat of a drum in the temple across the river. But he also heard the wind in the bamboo, the gentle clink of porcelain as his grandmother poured tea. And once, just once, a shamisen played behind a shuttered door, soft, unsure, beautiful. He carried those sounds in his chest like secret treasures. In early February, Ichiro fell ill. It began with a dry throat, then the chills, then the cough. His grandmother did not leave his side. She sat on the tatami mat with her back straight and eyes closed, reciting ancient verses under her breath. She fed him rice porridge with pickled plum, placed warm towels across his chest, and changed his linens twice each day. Ichiro drifted in and out of fever. He dreamed of lanterns floating through the sky. He dreamed of his father, lost in the Russo-Japanese War, smiling from across a river too wide to cross. He dreamed of the dolls his grandmother made, standing, walking, bowing. He did not wake for 3 days. When he opened his eyes again, she was still there. Her hair had loosened. Her hands trembled slightly, but she was smiling. "You are not ready to follow the lanterns," she said, and he, though too weak to speak, nodded. As the snow melted in March, the streets slowly refilled. Shoji screens were opened to the air. Shops reopened, though quieter than before. The city had not collapsed. It had changed. It had become slower, more reverent. People bowed deeper, walked more softly, left offerings at every shrine, even the small roadside ones half hidden by moss. Ichiro returned to the schoolhouse with 10 fewer classmates. He wore a mask sewn by his grandmother with a tiny crane embroidered near the edge. He kept to himself, his eyes older than his years. When the teacher asked the class to write a haiku about the winter, Ichiro wrote, "Lantern on the wind, my grandmother's voice like snow." I stayed with the light. The teacher did not speak. She only touched the paper gently. Years passed. Ichiro grew. The world changed. Wars came again. Cities burned and were rebuilt. But in his memory, that winter always lived. Soft, solemn, filled with the scent of rice and charcoal and the touch of his grandmother's hand. When he became an old man, he would sit in the doorway of his own home, folding paper cranes for his grandchildren, and tell them of the year the city wore masks and waited for the silence to end. And always, he told them of the lanterns and the voice that kept him close to the earth. Now, dear listener, let your eyes close like the paper, shutters at sundown. Let the scent of tea and snow drift through your thoughts. Let the lanterns of Tokyo, glowing softly behind garden walls, guide your dreams. Tomorrow we shall meet the patients of a sanatorium in the Alps, where fresh air was believed to cure all things, even grief. But for now, rest, stay with the light. High in the Swiss Alps, where the peaks cut into clouds like cold knives and pine forests wrapped the mountains in silence, there stood a building that seemed part of the sky itself. The Weisberg Sanatorium, a great white structure, all columns and glass balconies, perched on a ridge above the village of Rickenbach. The locals called it the House of Breaths, not only because it treated diseases of the lungs, but because the whole place seemed suspended between sigh and whisper. In the winter of 1919, the air around Weisberg was so clear that you could see for 50 miles on a good day. But for those within, the view was often lost in a haze of fever and dreams. The Spanish flu arrived at Weisberg in December. They thought at first they were above it, protected by elevation, by solitude, by snow. After all, the sanatorium had long been a haven for those escaping consumption, war, or scandal. Patients came from Vienna, Prague, Paris. Poets, heiresses, retired officers, all wrapped in blankets, reclining on balconies, waiting for the mountain air to mend what medicine could not. But viruses climb mountains too. One of the nurses, returning from her family in Zurich, brought the fever back with her. Within days, 5 patients had taken ill. By the end of the month, there were 20. The director, Dr. Johannes Kessler, was a meticulous man. His white coat always pressed, his gold spectacles never out of line. He had trained in Berlin and believed deeply in discipline, in routine, in the quiet art of observation. He gathered the patients into groups, suspected, mild, severe. He separated the floors. Masks were made of linen and boiled twice daily. Balconies were closed to shared use. The dining hall was repurposed as a fever ward. Still, the sickness spread. Kessler, though calm in voice, began to write longer and longer entries in his journal. Late at night, he paced the library, his reflection flickering in the window pane beside rows of unopened novels. He had once believed in logic above all, but now he began to pray. Among the patients was a young woman named Lotta Weber. She was 17. Her hair was the color of birch bark, and she had been sent to Weisberg for nervous exhaustion after losing both her parents in the war. She barely spoke, but kept a sketchbook by her side at all times, her fingers stained with charcoal. When the fever came, she watched the others from her balcony, thin forms bundled in coats, coughing into handkerchiefs that bloomed red. She drew them each day. She gave them wings. She gave them masks made of petals. She gave them halos made of ash. Her closest companion was an older gentleman, Herr Ulrich Braun, a retired mathematics professor from Heidelberg, who had once tutored royalty. He wore thick gloves and carried a gold pocket watch which he wound, precisely at 4 o'clock each day. He did not believe in angels, but he did believe in Lotta. He brought her tea when she was too weak to draw. He read to her from Goethe, and when her fever rose, he sat beside her, murmuring equations under his breath. Not to cure, but to comfort. There is order in the universe, he said, even in sorrow. Lotta survived, Herr Braun did not. She drew his portrait 3 days after his death. Eyes closed, a flower in his hands. She placed it under her pillow and spoke to no one for a week. The nurses did what they could. They boiled linens. They sang lullabies in Swiss-German dialects. They carved crosses in the snow outside the sanatorium, one for each life lost. Some of them fell ill themselves. One, Sister Emily, passed away on her birthday. They buried her beneath a pine tree on the east slope. Each patient placed a stone at the base of the tree. A small cairn grew there, a mountain for a life. By March, the fever had loosened its grip. Fresh snow melted on the balconies. The air began to smell of pine needles again. Survivors emerged, thinner, quieter, but breathing. Dr. Kessler removed his spectacles one morning and simply stared out across the peaks. His hands trembled slightly. He had seen many deaths in his career, but never this many, never this fast. He wrote no journal entry that day. Instead, he spent an hour standing in the library, opening one book at a time, letting the scent of paper and dust rise to his senses. Something familiar, something still alive. Lotta returned to her drawing, this time not of patients or angels. She drew the mountain, then the sky, then a staircase of stars. When she left Weisberg the following summer, she left her sketchbook with Dr. Kessler. It now rests in a glass case in a museum in Bernauer Testament. They say, to the beauty born even in breathlessness. Years later, when the sanatorium closed and the building became a hotel, guests sometimes reported strange sensations. Cold drafts on warm nights, the sound of soft humming, the scent of rosemary on the stairs. No one was afraid. Some even said it felt like being watched over. Tonight, let your dreams drift upward into thin, silent air. Let the stars over Weisberg shine through your thoughts like soft candlelight. Let the hush of snow, the murmur of wind between pines, and the turn of a pocket watch guide you gently into rest. Tomorrow, we shall journey to Brazil, where the flu rode the rivers into the rainforest and was met with both fear and fierce resistance. But for now, sleep on the balcony, breathe deep, and live. The Amazon River moved like a serpent through the forest, wide, slow, eternal. Its waters whispered secrets to the roots of ancient trees, fed the vines that draped like curtains from the canopy, and mirrored the sky in shades of green and gold. In 1919, longboats, canoes, and steam launches plied its currents, their wakes rippling into the silence of the rainforest. And aboard one such boat came the flu. It arrived in barrels, in boots, in the breath of a traveller whose name history does not remember, but the river remembers. It always remembers. The village of São Padre lay just beyond a bend in the Tapajós River, a cluster of homes on stilts, a chapel painted pale blue. and a schoolhouse built of palm and clay. The people there lived by rhythm, the rising sun, the seasonal rains, the fish caught and fruit gathered, the Sunday bells. News from the cities came slowly, if at all. So when the boat moored to the riverbank and a trader stepped ashore coughing, no one suspected. They greeted him with cassava bread and cups of cooled mate. He stayed the night. By morning, the fever had begun. Maria Aniceta, the midwife, was the first to notice. She had seen fevers before. Malaria, dengue, infection from a dirty knife. But this moved like wildfire. Children who had been playing one day lay listless the next. Men who had rowed all morning could not rise by evening. She went door to door with herbs wrapped in banana leaves, whispering prayers in both Portuguese and Ningatu, the trade language of the forest. She tied crimson cords above thresholds, burned copaiba resin at night, but the sickness did not listen. By the end of the week, the schoolteacher, the priest, and the village headman had all died. The chapel bell no longer rang. In the jungle beyond, the forest tribes watched. The Kayapo, the Arapiam, the Munduruku, each kept to their lands, but the wind brought word. The spirits, they said, were being stirred. The birds flew strange. The monkeys called at night. The old trees whispered of imbalance. Some left offerings, feathers, beads, smoked fish laid at the riverside. Others retreated deeper into the forest. But the river kept flowing. Maria Aniceta refused to leave. She was 72. She had delivered every child in São Padre for 2 generations. Her knees ached. Her hands shook, but her voice remained steady. God gave me this life, she said. The forest gave me the rest. I will not abandon either. She organized a watch. 4 women, 6 young men, and the few elders still well enough to stand. They boiled water, fanned the sick, sang lullabies when the coughing became too much. They dug graves when the singing stopped. On the 6th night, the sky opened. Rain poured like a benediction, washing the dust, cooling the earth, and drumming against the thatched roofs like 1,000 quiet prayers. Maria knelt beneath the eaves and let it fall on her face. She did not cry, but the forest wept for her. In the weeks that followed, other villages sent canoes with bundles of manioc, jars of honey, and bundles of medicinal bark. A medicine woman from a neighboring tribe arrived in silence, marked in blue paint, her hair braided with seeds. She and Maria spoke few words. They did not need many. They knew the rhythm of care. By March, the fever began to fade. The riverboat, trader, its first harbinger, had long since vanished into memory. Of the 187 souls who had lived in São Padre before the illness, 94 remained. But the jungle was alive, and life, in the Amazon, does not surrender easily. The chapel was reopened. Its new priest was a boy of 16, Matthias, who had once served Mass and now wore the vestments of the departed. He did not preach grand sermons. He lit candles. He sang quietly. He told the children stories of how the river mourned and then healed. Maria Aniceta lived another 6 years. She never left the village. Her final act, before passing in her sleep beneath a woven blanket, was to plant a guava tree where the old priest had been buried. She said, "Let sweetness grow where sorrow once stood." It did. The river still flows past São Padre. New homes have risen. The school has been rebuilt. The guava tree stands tall, its branches heavy with fruit. And the children are told, in whispered tales, of the year when breath became precious. And the forest itself stood still. When asked how they survived, the elders say, "We listened, we waited, we remembered." Tonight, dear friend, let your breath match the river's gentle pull. Let the rustle of palm leaves and the hush of falling rain lull your thoughts into stillness. Let the guava tree bloom in your dreams. Tomorrow, we will enter a coal mine in Wales, where the black dust and the white fever met, and where songs were sung in darkness. But for now, close your eyes and float. in the narrow valley of Fabulum Arbor, where the heather crept down the hillsides like purple smoke and sheep grazed beneath slate-grey skies, the earth breathed coal. It was 1918, and life in this corner of South Wales pulsed with the steady rhythm of picks and shovels, of boots against stone, of men descending before dawn into shafts carved through rock and shadow. The mine was more than labour. It was heritage, legacy, and survival. Each boy knew, by the time he could lace his boots, that he too would one day walk into the mountain. But that year, something darker than coal came crawling into the village, not through the mine, but through breath. They called it Yr Haint Du, the Black Sickness. Not because of its colour, but because of its silence, because it stole the voice, the breath, the very song from a man's lungs. It began with a cough, a fever. Then came the blue lips, the rattling chest, and the stillness that followed. The first to fall was Emrys, a young collier of 23, who had returned home from Cardiff with a new flat cap and a slight sniffle. By the end of the week, his mother, brother, and the neighbour next door were also coughing. By the end of the month, the chapel bell had rung 16 times. Evan Parry, foreman of the CWM Eber Colliery, was a man not easily shaken. He had worked the mines for over 30 years, his voice as gravelly as the tunnels he walked. When the first cases appeared, he ordered the pit to remain open. "It's no use standing still," he said. "The coal won't wait." But the virus did not care for coal. It sank into the lungs of the strongest men, twisted their bodies into bedsheets, and left them breathless within days. Even Evan's brother, Dafydd, a tenor in the chapel choir, was gone before the next Sunday service. Then the chapel itself was shuttered, the pulpit draped in black, the pews silent. The women held the village together. They boiled flannel cloths in camphor, burned vinegar-soaked rags to clean the air, and brewed dandelion teas and bone broths. Their hands bled from washing, and their eyes grew red from weeping, but they kept moving. Mayor Elin Hughes, the midwife and village healer, became something more. She was not a nurse. She had no training, no diploma, but she knew how to cool a fever with mint leaves. She knew how to sing a hymn in a way that slowed a child's breath. And when her husband died, she washed his body herself, wrapped him in his miner's coat, and dug the grave behind the cottage with the help of 2 neighbour boys. After that, no one questioned her authority. One night, in the heart of December, when the frost clung to windows like lace, and no coal fires could drive out the cold entirely, a sound rose through the valley. It was not the coughs. It was not the bell. It was singing. Low at first. A boy's voice, trembling but steady, lifting from a window crack. The hymn was A Heidi Nos, all through the night, a lullaby for the weary. Soon, another voice joined, then another. Windows opened, lamps flickered to life, and for the first time in many weeks, the streets of Cwmbwlbymem Arbor echoed not with sorrow, but with song. Every night thereafter, at 7 o'clock, the singing began, not as celebration, not in defiance, but in remembrance, in reverence. The villagers stood at their thresholds, scarves over mouths, candles in their hands, and let their voices carry across the rooftops. They sang of the hills, of the lambs, of the valleys, of the peace that passeth understanding. Children learned the words, even if they didn't understand them. The sick smiled behind closed shutters, and the dead, perhaps, listened. The colliery lay silent for months. The rust crept onto the tracks. The pulleys froze. The canaries in their cages sang to no one, but the coal remained. And so did the people. By February, the flu had begun to release its grip. It did not vanish all at once. It faded, like a storm cloud dissolving into mist. The funerals became fewer, the coughs receded, and one by one, the lamps returned to the mine. Evan Parry, now thinner and with silver in his beard, was the first to descend again. He touched the tunnel walls as he passed, murmuring the names of the men who had never come back. That day, no coal was cut. Only silence observed. Siuem Aber changed. It had always been a place of hardship, but now it was a place of memory. Each year, on the anniversary of that first terrible winter, the villagers gather at the pit head. They do not speak. They simply sing. They sing the same hymn that echoed on that cold December night. Not loud, not mournful, but whole. Mayor Elin Hughes died many years later. Her funeral was held in the reopened chapel. No sermon was read, only songs, and one note left on her grave, written in a child's hand. She gave us light in the dark. Now, dear listener, let your thoughts drift like mist along the ridges of South Wales. Hear the voices, rich and resonant, singing of valleys and stars. Let the echo of coal-dusted hands and hymns carry you softly into rest. Tomorrow, we shall follow a violinist through the snow-laced towns of Eastern Europe, where music passed from carriage to coffin, and beauty was born from grief. But tonight, sleep under the hills and listen. The trains still ran through Galicia, even in the heart of winter. Their black engines groaned and hissed across the snowy plains, scattering crows and echoes as they came. Their windows were frosted, their compartments half empty, filled with the sounds of boots and breath and the creaking of worn wood. Passengers spoke little. The air was tight with mourning. The war was over. But peace had not yet arrived, and the flu rode the rails, slipping between borders like smoke, coughing softly from carriage to carriage. On a bitter January morning in 1919, a man stepped onto the platform at Tarnov with nothing but a violin case and a small satchel of bread and salt. His name was Jakub Klein. He had been a concert violinist in Krakow before the war, before his wife died in childbirth, before his son vanished in the Austro-Hungarian draft, before the theatres closed and the city turned grey with silence. Now he wandered, not aimlessly, but as one who followed sorrow like a lantern. Jakub played at every station where the trains stopped. He stood at the edge of the platform, his coat patched with threadbare wool, and he lifted the violin beneath his chin as if to pray. He never asked for coin, never spread a hat. He played for the ones who had no names, those buried along the tracks in unmarked graves, the ones who had died between destinations. He played Bach, Schubert, klezmer melodies his grandfather once hummed beside the fire, and when a child peeked from behind a carriage curtain, he smiled and played a lullaby from the old days of the Pale, Tumbalalaika, soft and slow. He watched their eyes widen, then he disappeared into the smoke again. In Lwów, he played for a crowd of nurses resting in the street beside a field hospital. Their sleeves were stained, their eyes sunken, but as the first note rang out, clear and high like birdsong above a frozen field, they stopped. They listened. One of them began to hum, another closed her eyes. Jakub finished with a bowed head. Then he turned, nodded once, and walked on. They would never know his name, but they remembered the song. In the village of Bobrica, he found a square filled with funerary wagons. A priest stood beneath a tree, delivering rites to no one. The bodies lay in shrouds. There were no mourners, no candles. Jakub did not speak. He raised his bow and played a requiem, a piece written by a man who had never known plague, but who had feared death all the same. When he finished, the priest crossed himself and whispered, "They heard you." By February, word of the silent violinist had begun to spread. At stations from Przemysl to Zamość, children waited by the tracks with ears open. Women offered him hot broth and bread rolls. A soldier gave him gloves with holes in the fingers. Another, a bottle of plum brandy. He accepted none of it, only stories. "Play for my sister," said one boy, holding a locket. "Play for my mother," whispered a girl with bandaged hands. He did. Each note, a breath for the voiceless. One night, as the snow fell heavy and thick over a village long since emptied by the flu, Jakub found shelter in the chapel ruins beside a burnt-out inn. He lit a small fire and placed the violin beside him. He took out a folded scrap of paper from his coat, one he had carried for months. It was a letter from his son, the last he had received in the autumn of 1916. "I hear music in my dreams, Papa. Please keep playing. If I do not return, let me live in your songs." Jakub did not cry, but that night he played like a man who remembered the warmth of laughter. He played until the stars blinked away the snow. In early March, Jakub reached the town of Chelm. The station was quiet, but not empty. A Red Cross relief train stood puffing on the track, loading the sick and the tired. Beside the platform sat a girl in a black shawl, her cheeks flushed with fever. Jakub knelt before her and asked gently, "May I play for you?" She nodded, and he began the lullaby again. Tumbalalaika. His fingers trembling now, his chest tighter than before. Halfway through, he coughed. The girl reached out and touched his sleeve. "You are cold," she said. He smiled. "Yes, but the song is warm." 2 days later, the relief nurse on that train found his violin case near the back of a coal car. Inside was the instrument, still tuned. Beside it, a folded note. "For the next hands who remember." No one ever found Jakub Klein's body, but many remembered the man with the bow and the gaze that saw through silence. Years later, survivors in distant towns would still speak of him. "I heard the violinist," they'd say, "the one who played only for the dead," but others corrected them. No, he played for the living who remained. Today, in a small museum in Krakow, a cracked violin rests beneath glass. No label, no name, just a scrap of music handwritten in ink, yellowed with time. It reads, "Breathe with me, even now." And so, dear soul, as you drift into sleep, let your mind hear that distant melody rising over train tracks and snow. Let the bow dance across strings in your memory. Let the warmth of one man's song soothe the ache of loss. Tomorrow, we will enter the golden silence of a remote monastery in Greece, where the monks greeted the plague with stillness and found something sacred in the quiet. But for now, close your eyes and listen. Atop the sun-bleached cliffs of Mount Pelion, where olives twisted in the wind and goats wandered along dusty paths, the monastery of Agios Nelos stood white and still, like a prayer carved in limestone. It had watched centuries pass: Byzantine, emperors, Venetian ships, earthquakes and revolutions. It stood through storms and droughts, through Ottoman campaigns and winter famine. It was a place of fasting, prayer and quiet, a refuge for the soul, far above the noise of cities. In the spring of 1919, the world below had fallen silent for a different reason. The flu had come, and so the monks closed their gates. The community of Agios Nelos numbered 13. All men, all cloaked in black cassocks, their beards long, their hands calloused from tending bees and vines. Their days were marked by bells and incense, their nights by candlelight and silence. Their leader, Abbot Kyrillos, was a man of 70, with deep-set eyes and a voice that seldom rose above a whisper. He had been at the monastery since he was 16, and it was said he had not stepped beyond its outer path in over 40 years. When the message came by mule post that the sickness had reached Volos, the port town below, he gathered the brethren beneath the olive trees. "We will not run from this shadow," he said, "but we shall not open our doors to it either." The monks entered their great silence. It was not fear that closed the gates. It was devotion. They believed their calling was not to intervene, but to pray, to lift the world as one might lift a fallen branch, gently, with care, and place it upon sacred ground. And so they lit their candles, they kept vigil, and they waited. Brother Matthias, the youngest of them, had arrived only 6 months earlier. He had once studied medicine in Athens, had once danced in the square with cousins, kissed a girl beneath the apricot tree. But the war had taken his father and brothers. The flu had taken his mother, and the silence of Agios Nalos had taken him in. At first he struggled. He missed voices, the touch of hands, the clutter of daily life. But over time, he came to feel the rhythm of the place, the heartbeat of old stone, the wind through the cypress, the psalms carried not by mouths, but by thought. Each monk had a task. Brother Ionas tended the vines. Brother Petros kept the bees. Brother Nicodemus, half blind but steady, transcribed ancient texts by hand in the library with a magnifying lens made from a chipped goblet. No one spoke unless it was necessary, but they did not feel alone. One day, in late April, a boy appeared at the gate. He was barefoot, thin, his shirt torn. He carried a younger child on his back, his sister perhaps, and his eyes were dark with exhaustion. He knocked only once, then collapsed. The monks did not speak. They opened the gate, carried the children in, and laid them on straw mats in the guest house. Brother Matthias tended to them. He had not practiced medicine in years, but his hands remembered. He washed their faces. He spooned water between their lips. He sang old lullabies, the ones his mother had once whispered beside the fire. The boy's name was Elias. The girl's name was Zoe. They had walked for days after their parents died. Zoe's fever rose. The monks gathered outside her window in the night and recited the Psalter aloud for the first time in months, each voice joining the others in trembling harmony. Their song rose like incense through the rafters. She opened her eyes at dawn and smiled. The children remained at Agios Nalos. They were given new clothes, soft sandals, and chores. Zoe fed the doves. Elias carried pails of water. Neither spoke much, but both listened. They learned the names of herbs. They learned how to trim the vines and gather olives. They learned silence, not as a prison, but as a kind of music. Brother Matthias sat with them each evening after Compline, telling them stories without raising his voice. Tales of saints and storms, of angels disguised as strangers, of fishermen who turned into fireflies when they died with joy. The children laughed softly, and the monastery laughed with them. By summer, word came from Volos. The sickness had passed. The market had reopened. Bells rang again, but the monks did not descend. Instead, Abbot Kyrillos took Elias and Zoe to the top of the western cliff, where the sea glimmered like glass. He handed them a small loaf of bread and 2 clay cups. "This," he said, "is your blessing. The world waits for you, but you may always return." The children stayed another season, and then they left. Brother Matthias did not. He remained. Not because he feared the world, but because he had found something inside the silence that no city could match. A stillness that breathed, a stillness that remembered. Many years later, a woman named Zoe returned to Agios Nalos. She was old, with grey hair and eyes like sunlit stone. She brought her grandson. Together they sat in the courtyard, where the olive trees still swayed and the beehives still hummed. She whispered, "Once, this place saved my name." And then she was quiet again. The monks buried Abbot Kyrillos beneath his favourite fig tree. His gravestone bore no title, only the inscription, "He listened for all of us." Now, dear soul, let your mind wander beneath olive branches and the soft steps of robed monks. Let the hush of psalms carry you inward. Let silence hold your breath, not as a weight, but as a gift. Tomorrow we will walk the war-torn streets of Istanbul, where east met west, and where loss was written not in stone, but in sand. But tonight, let the wind through old trees lull you and rest. In 1919, Istanbul was a city at the edge of breath. It sprawled like a tapestry across hills and straits, its minarets piercing the sky like prayers turned to stone. The Bosphorus shimmered in the early light, and the calls to prayer echoed through, streets still lined with the ruins of fallen empires. It had once been Constantinople, seat of emperors, gateway between east and west. But now it was weary. The war had bled the city dry. The Ottoman Empire was dying, and into that aching silence the flu slipped, unseen, yet everywhere. In the shadow of the Blue Mosque, where shadows stretched long between the arches, a boy named Halil sat selling roasted chestnuts beside his uncle's spice store. He was 12, with nimble fingers and a scar above his left brow from a fall on cobblestones. His father had died in the war, his mother of fever, his sister taken in by an Armenian widow who had no children of her own. Halil had only the streets, and the streets were coughing. He first noticed it in the old man who swept the courtyard near Hagia Sophia, once a church, then a mosque, now a museum in waiting. The man's broom slowed. His back hunched further. One morning, he did not come. Then the baklava seller disappeared. Then the calligrapher with ink-stained fingers. Then the woman with the parrot who sold tulips from her balcony. One by one, the city fell silent again. Not from war, from breathlessness. Halil stayed. He wore a cloth across his face, soaked each morning in rosewater and lemon. He slept beneath the awning of the abandoned madrasa and kept a candle burning beside him when night fell, as if the flame alone could keep him visible to God. In his dreams, he still heard his mother singing the lullaby she had once sung when rocking his sister. Uyusun da büyüsün, sleep, so you may grow. He whispered it to himself when the coughs woke him, and to the dying when no one else was near. The hospitals were overwhelmed. The doctors stretched thin, their masks streaked with sweat. Medicine was scarce. The Red Crescent. Wagons carried more bodies than bandages. So the sick spilled into mosques, into bathhouses, into schools long emptied by fear. Volunteers handed out masks at ferry stations. Priests and imams blessed the dead side by side. For once, the city's faiths mourned together. Halil began to carry messages, not for coin, but for the need to move, to help, to matter. He ran through the winding alleys of Balat and the merchant squares of Karaköy, delivering notes scribbled in Greek, Armenian, Arabic, Ladino, French. Names of the ill, names of the lost, words of love, lists of herbs, instructions for burial. He tucked the letters into his shirt and whispered their contents to no one. I am Istanbul's breath, he told himself. I must not lose it. One evening, while crossing the Galata Bridge at dusk, he paused at the midpoint and looked down at the water. The ferries were fewer now, the gulls circling slower, and yet the Bosphorus still shimmered, still carried lanterns from one shore to the next. In that moment, he heard music, a ney flute, soft and slow, rising from somewhere near the docks. He followed it and found an old man seated on a crate, playing with eyes closed, the notes curving into the air like incense. When the man stopped, Halil asked, "Why do you play when there is so much death?" The old man smiled gently, so they will not forget how to live. That night, Halil dreamed he was walking the city alone, barefoot, but unafraid. The stones beneath his feet glowed. The streets remembered every name he had whispered. The wind carried the prayers of 3 religions at once, and he walked on. By May, the fever began to ease. The markets stirred. The ferries returned. Halil's uncle reopened his spice store, thinner but alive. The chestnut cart was never claimed again, so Halil made it his. He roasted carefully, wrapped each portion in a square of clean paper, handed them to passers-by with a nod. He no longer accepted coins, only names. "Tell me who you've lost," he'd say, and they would. He wrote the names down in a small ledger. At the end of each week, he took the notebook to the edge of the old Roman aqueduct and read the names aloud at sunset. Then he closed the book and waited until the muezzin's voice rose into the evening sky. Years passed. Istanbul changed again. The empires faded. The streets filled once more. New wars came. New songs were sung. But beneath one awning in the older quarter of the city, a man sat with a cart of chestnuts and a notebook on his lap. He never raised his voice, but those who passed him often said they felt seen. He never stopped writing names. No one knows where he is buried, but a plaque stands beside the aqueduct today. It bears no statue, only a question. Do you remember who carried your breath? Now, as the night deepens, let your dreams flow like the Bosphorus in spring. Let the scent of roasted chestnuts drift into your thoughts. Let the names you carry, those remembered, those whispered, those lost, settle gently on the wind. Tomorrow we shall come to the end of this tale, in the final part of our series, a quiet reckoning in a rural graveyard, where memory and forgiveness entwine like roots in sacred earth. But tonight, rest in the city between worlds and dream. There is a kind of silence that lingers longer than sound. Not the silence of emptiness, nor of fear, but of reverence. In the spring of 1920, in a small rural village whose name had long since slipped from the headlines, the grass grew long between the graves. The churchyard was quiet. The last bell had rung months before, and the world, weary and blinking in the pale dawn of peace, turned its face slowly toward life again. But the dead remained, not in haunting, but in hush. The village lay in the shadow of gentle hills, with poplar trees lining its paths and wild violets dotting the meadows. It had been spared the shellfire of war. Its soil had never trembled beneath marching boots, but the flu had come, carried on the wind and wheels of a travelling peddler, whose name no one remembered. He sold combs and sewing needles. He sneezed once in the square, and within a week, 12 were ill. By winter's end, the churchyard had nearly doubled. Now, as the first swallows returned from the south, the villagers began to emerge, not with fanfare, but with quiet hands and slower steps. They opened shutters, mended fences, reseeded fields, and they came to the graveyard, one by one, not to mourn, but to remember. Among them was old Nanny Pell, who had been the midwife since the reign of Queen Victoria. She brought her garden scissors and a basket of ivy cuttings. She placed them beside each headstone she had once walked a child past. "Grow here," she said softly. "Climb toward the sky." She did not speak of sorrow. She spoke of green. There was Father Anselm, whose voice had once filled the nave with thunder. Now he knelt by the smallest graves, tracing names with a trembling finger. He carried a small leather-bound book of blessings, but he did not read from it. He simply closed his eyes and listened. The children came too. They were quieter than before, more easily hushed, but they were alive. They brought wildflowers plucked from the edge of the stream. Some did not know the names of the ones they placed them beside, but they placed them anyway, because it was the right thing. And then there was Mrs. Winifred Kelsey. She was neither nurse nor priest, just a weaver of blankets, a widow, the kind of woman who knew every chimney's smell, every door's creak. She had lost no one in the flu, but she visited every grave, and with a pencil and paper, she began to write down their names. She did not know why, at first, only that forgetting seemed dangerous and remembering an act of defiance. By midsummer, her list had grown to 4 pages, each name followed by a birth year if she could recall it. A trade, a memory. Thomas Ashe, cooper, smelled of clove and tobacco, whistled always. Mara Elkins, midwife's apprentice, sang off key and laughed anyway. She left a copy in the church, another with the schoolmistress, and one nailed to the lich gate. At the top, it read, "The ones we carried." Years passed. The fields bloomed again. The houses were painted. The laughter returned, though it sounded a little older, a little wiser. People stopped speaking of the sickness, but they did not forget. Each year, on the first day of spring, the villagers gathered in the graveyard. They brought not wreaths or mourning garb, but food and music and chairs. They sat among the stones and told stories of how Granny Cora once tricked the baker into giving her 2 loaves, of how quiet little Henry could jump clean over the brook, of how the town drunk once recited Shakespeare with perfect clarity during a thunderstorm. Laughter came easily. So did tears, and when dusk fell, they lit small candles and placed them at the base of the yews, not to chase the darkness, but to honour it. By the 1950s, the flu was a chapter in history books. By the 1970s, a footnote. By the 2000s, a forgotten murmur. But in that little village, where the grass grew greenest near the oldest stones, the tradition never stopped. Not because the people were superstitious, but because they had learned what silence costs and how gently memory must be carried. In 2020, a scholar arrived, young, curious, carrying cameras and notebooks. She asked why they gathered still. "Because the world forgot," said an old man, "but we still live among names." She stayed the night, wrote nothing, but wept at sunset. Now, dear dreamer, you have walked with me across 20 chapters, through cities and fields, silence and song. You have felt the hands of nurses, the songs of miners, the breath of children, the grief of priests. You have carried their names, and they have carried you. As this story closes, I ask only this: do not rush from this memory. Do not seal it behind glass. Carry it softly, like a folded note, a quiet tune, a candle in the wind. For we too live in the echo of what was, and we too shape the silence to come. Sleep now, gentle soul. Let the roots hold your weight. Let the stones remember for you, and let your breath, like all those who came before, rise softly into the night. Good night.